This landscape on the edge of the Peak District holds the key to an incredible story. A story that begins with the eager enthusiasm of 1,000 men and ends in the hell of the First World War. It's a story that's left a telling mark on the British landscape, a poignant reminder of the sacrifice of a generation in the fields of France. Sheffield, in the heart of the industrial north.
I mean, we can see the moor just coming into view now. I mean, was there lots of archaeology up there?
Oh yeah, God, there's archaeology of all sorts. But this is the site I've brought you to see. Can you see on this hill here? There's a bit of quarrying on the top.
Yes.
But look at that confusion of lines curving around the north side of the slope.
Oh, look, I can just see them coming in. They're
Yep.
everywhere. Sort of snaky lines and curves and straight lines and zigzags and...
Yeah, that sort of square cut shape there.
That's
yeah.
right. And there's a whole lot of little circular things there. Aren't those extraordinary?
This precious site is one of only a handful in Britain today. The extraordinary marks are all that remains of military trenches. Trenches that were dug by men training for battle in the First World War. On the ground, it's difficult to see the trenches now, but from the air, they're very clear.
Dave, can you point me to them?
You're actually very close to a line of trenches, Mark. They're just behind you.
Hang on, I'll see what I can see.
Well, if you take 2 or 3 paces forward, that's it. There you go, you're standing in one now.
Yeah, actually, it's a really clear trench just in here. Hang on, I'll follow it along.
Yeah, that's right. Keep going down.
I have picked it up along here again. Like a sort of zigzag, rather like the sort of crenellations of a castle laid out here on the moor.
Mark, there's so much more. I'm just going to see if we can make any sense out of the patterns of trenching up here.
It was local archaeologists who discovered these First World War training trenches. Christine Sterling was one of the team who untangled the mystery. The story of the men who trained for battle, here on the moor, begins just a few miles away, and almost 90 years ago, in Sheffield. At the time of the First World War, Sheffield was a thriving city. The quality of Sheffield steel was renowned across the world, and the city would soon be known as the world's arsenal. Soon after war broke out, Sheffield men were asked to enlist. Queues quickly formed outside the city's rather grand town hall, where I met Carl Noble, historian of the Sheffield Volunteers.
So they would have queued up these very stairs?
That's right, all the way and out onto the street.
Sort of 4 abreast?
Quite probably.
And the table would be at the top here?
Yes.
So how many people responded to the call for volunteers?
Well, from Sheffield, there was 1,400 in the original call-up that came here.
What sort of background did they come from? Were they miners and factory workers?
No, I mean, this was an unusual battalion in that most of them either came from the university or the officers. They were professional people.
So is this the list of all the soldiers that were eventually enlisted into the regiment?
This is a nominal roll, as they call it, of the NCOs, non-commissioned officers, and men who were signed up.
So here we've got the list: 945 Hartley, 949 Hedworth J, 951 Hen FM. I mean, do we know anything about these people?
Well, yes. I mean, for example, Hen here, we have his dog tags.
That's his name there, Hen.
That's his religion, Church of England, and that's his battalion, 12th York and Lancaster, and at the top you can see his service number. Everyone that joined up was given some dog tags, so when they went into the field, if they were killed or anything, they could be identified. And this is another thing that was issued to all the troops. It's called the Soldier's Small Book, and you can see it says the Sheffield Battalion of the York and Lancaster Regiment.
Right.
And this is also for Hen. And inside are all his personal details, also his background, his date of birth.
Well, hang on, trade or calling departmental manager. So, in fact, he was quite an important guy.
That's right.
Private Hen and his friends had joined the Sheffield City Battalion. The battalion boosted the size of Britain's army, which was far too small for full-scale war. Around the country, hordes of enthusiastic young men answered Lord Kitchener's call for reinforcements. Brothers, neighbours, friends and workmates enlisted together and formed what became known as the Pals Battalions. In December 1914, the Sheffield Pals marched to the moors in the cold and rain. Training on the bleak hills would make them a tough fighting unit, fit for war on the Western Front. The trenches they learnt to dig on the moor are still visible today. With the help of military analyst Ellie Goldsworthy, Dave's having a closer look.
If I understand you correctly then, digging trenches is still an important bit of modern military training.
Well, even 8 years ago when I was at Sandhurst, one of the toughest exercises we had was a digging exercise, and that was a 4-day exercise. The first 2 days was digging trenches, no sleep, no rest, digging trenches, and it was extremely hard. Every British Army officer and every British soldier knows how to dig a trench. That's not because we anticipate fighting any kind of trench warfare style war, but it's about knowing the importance of digging in when you need to dig in to protect troops and to hold ground.
Right, I think I need some of your military expertise to bring out what's actually happening with this incredible network of trenching here.
Well, certainly the way the British Army trades today is that they would dig trenches and then they would fill them in at the end and then exercise in a new location and start again. And it would seem eminently sensible that's the way they would be training, which would account for some of the muddle that it would appear from the air up here.
Yeah, well, what about the area where it seems a bit more organised, just beneath the quarries there?
That bit there is much clearer, and it seems that you can actually see what looks like the front line or the front 2 lines of trenches there. And what's interesting is that you can see the front line wasn't a straight line, but it was shaped like the top of a castle. They were set back at right
square
angles.
cut.
Yes, you can see just there, just set back at right angles. And that was, firstly, that meant that any incoming shells wouldn't blast along the line. But it also meant that soldiers could fire on enemy positions from different angles and different positions. So that, and look, you can see very clearly there.
Yeah, absolutely. I see exactly what you mean there, yeah.
If we look at a trench manual that I've got here, you can see the same kind of castle top effect.
It's very similar to that bit down there, isn't it?
Very
Basically.
similar. Here, look, that's the communications trench that comes back from it, through which all the ammunition would be brought up.
Yeah.
That's the system of trenches that they used out in France as well.
So you think all these sort of little sort of bumps and hollows associated with the trenches maybe relate to things like latrines and small dugouts?
Yes, sure, yes,
Yeah.
ammunition's dumps and all the rest of it.
All over Britain, thousands of raw recruits were gradually shaped into soldiers. Discipline and teamwork were important, but a lot of the training was designed to get the men physically fit. The recruits worked hard and spirits were high. They were oblivious to the real horror that awaited them. After months of hard training, the Pals left the moors, looking forward to seeing action at last. Confidence was high as they left the city. Hundreds of people lined the streets of Sheffield to see them off. In early 1916, the battalion received new orders. They were on their way to France, to an area named after a local river few would have heard of, the Somme. When the Sheffield Pals reached northern France in March 1916, Britain had been at war in Europe for 18 months. The Germans had taken the high ground at the Somme, and their objective was to hold their line. Britain and its allies were holding a line to the west, and the war had reached stalemate. But now an Allied attack was planned for the summer. The offensive would become known as the Battle of the Somme.
So what was the Sheffield Pals' role in all this?
The Sheffield Pals were on the left flank of the advancing British push forward, which is the northernmost tip over there.
So they were really given a really important role.
Yes, and it's something to remember that while the Sheffield Battalion were enthusiastic and they were well trained and they were very positive about what they were doing, they had no battle experience, and yet they were entrusted with this extremely important role.
But also an extremely dangerous one.
Extremely dangerous.
When the Sheffield Pals arrived in France, the opposing front line stretched for over 400 miles. Behind them was a warren of communication and supply trenches that dwarfed what the Pals had dug on the moors. In Ocean VA, 2 miles from the Sheffield Pals front line, Avril Williams has restored one of these trenches, discovered in her back garden.
Avril, it's not everybody who's got a trench in their back garden. I mean, however did you find it?
My cellar was collapsing. The pipe band came in, redid the cellar to secure it, and then we discovered that there was a trench, an entrance into the cellar. And here we are.
We're, about a mile back from the front line here? I mean,
well, this is a frontline village. Frontline villages are utilised by all soldiers. So Beaumont Hamel was used by the Germans. We utilised Auchinvillas.
When the Sheffield Pals came to this part,
yes,
in April 1916, what function would this trench have served?
This is a stretcher bearer's post. And then they went through there, right the way through the village, and utilised all cellars, 140 cellars.
So there were individual cellars being connected by a network of trenches that would have led to the front lines?
Yes, and this is why it's straight. It's a communication trench, not a firing trench. Totally different.
And were they vulnerable to enemy fire in this place?
Shells would have come across, but the shells would have taken the house and the barns away, but left the trenches intact.
This is actually quite well made. I mean, there's bricks on the floor.
Mm-hmm. These are communication trenches. In the front line, they're always being blasted. Communication trenches, you can actually have time to work out what you're going to do.
Can I go and have an explore?
You can. You must mind your head.
The Sheffield Pals had swapped their city streets for a subterranean maze of trenches with names like Piccadilly and First Avenue. By June 1916, the Sheffield Pals were marching through trenches like these to the front line. Now, they were just days away from playing their part in the big push, a massive offensive planned for July the 1st. Today, a strip of woodland marks the Sheffield Pals section of the British front line. In 1916, the German front line was just 200 metres away. The Pals Trench is still just visible at the edge of the wood. In the last days of June, this was where they waited for battle.
Atmospheric place.
Yes.
So this is the place where the Sheffield Pals gathered before the Battle of the Somme?
Yes, this is where they dug in, and this was their rear line, and we're walking up gradient now to the front line. They were all crammed in here the weeks before the big push, and this would have been a hive of activity with all the preparations taking place here on the ground.
All these shell holes and so forth.
Yes, it's very, very bumpy, and it's quite a steep uphill, and it would have felt quite secure for them here. And of course, there'd have been a lot of expectancy, a lot of sense of excitement and anticipation of what was happening. These were troops that had been static for a long time, and many of them were looking forward to an opportunity to show what they could do, and none of these had fought big battles before.
So this is the Sheffield Pals front line?
Yes, this was the front line, and if you can see over there, Sarah's just beyond, and that was their objective. And if you look at the orders I've got here, these were the original ones for the actual push.
I mean, this is the actual bit of paper, almost. You can imagine the captain standing here with his men behind him, reading those, looking in the same way that we're looking.
That's right, and probably the first time these have been back in France since that day. And it says here, all troops will push forward to their objective regardless of movements of other troops on their left and on their right.
So they just had to go straight forward.
Push on forward, no matter who's being killed or shot, left or right, you keep pushing on. And that's exactly the same kind of tactic that would be used on the modern battlefield. No matter what you see to your left and right, you've got to keep going and following the orders.
Yeah, I've got a document here that actually is the special order of the day. I mean, this is absolutely
And what
tingling.
date was that?
This is the 28th of June 1916 by the Brigadier General in charge of the brigade. And he sets out, this is a morale-boosting memo, really. You are about to attack the enemy with far greater numbers than he can oppose you, supported by a huge number of guns. Englishmen have always proved better than the Germans were when the odds were heavily against them. It's now our opportunity. You are about to fight in one of the greatest battles in the world, and in the most just cause. Remember that the British Empire will anxiously watch your every move, and that the honour of the North Country rests in your hands. Keep your heads, do your duty, and you will utterly defeat the enemy.
Such a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of young men who had never been in battle before.
The Sheffield Pals were moving up to their front line when this aerial photograph was taken on the 29th of June. It clearly shows the Pals' front line and the German trenches. In the days running up to the Battle of the Somme, the British constantly bombarded the German lines with their biggest guns. The pounding would cut the thick German barbed wire, knock out their machine gunners and flatten their trenches. That was the plan. On the battlefield, I met archaeologist Martin Brown in the German lines. Martin, these trenches are so impressively deep.
That's right, it's something you notice on photographs from the period. These German trenches, which is what we're in, were massively constructed, they were very deep, and the Allies comment on this quite regularly.
So we're right on the German front line here?
Absolutely, yes. This is it. We've got a traverse here, a fire bay, front line trench looking towards the Allied line there, and then this is just a little sap or machine gun post or something like that, just projecting slightly forward into no man's land to give you a field of fire or vision.
So in other words, that's where the snipers might be?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, were the German trenches a lot more elaborate than the British ones?
They're certainly much better built. They're sometimes twice as deep as the Allied trenches.
I mean, do they have manuals? Do they know how to build these things?
They do. They have things called the field fortification manuals. And we've got here, this is the plans for German deep dugouts, 13 feet deep, into the chalk, which of course is wonderful for tunnelling and it's very strong. And that's great because it keeps you warm, it keeps you dry, it protects you from weather like this, and it protects you from shells coming in. Anything except really the biggest howitzer shells that are being dropped on you.
So you could huddle down underground, safe from the artillery barrage that rained overhead.
You could, but huddles really underplaying what they've got down there. There are whole systems of tunnels, field kitchens, dressing stations, headquarters, command centres, the works. That's one of the reasons that the 1st of July attack goes so disastrously wrong for the Allies, because they think that the Germans are obliterated, and actually what they're doing is sitting down there waiting to start running up the steps.
The British made one last effort to dislodge the Germans. At 7:28 a.m. on the 1st of July, minutes before the attack, the British set off 66,000 pounds of explosives underground. The Sheffield Pals would have heard the explosion as it ripped through the earth on the German lines. And the crater still survives today. At 90 metres wide and almost 30 metres deep, it's the largest remaining crater on the Western Front. Although hundreds of German soldiers died here, thousands still remained, waiting in their trenches. Almost 2 years after they joined up, the Sheffield Pals were finally seeing full-scale action. But on the 1st of July 1916, this landscape was the setting for the bloodiest day in British military history. At 7:30 a.m, the order was given for the Allies to attack. But by the end of that first day, over 57,000 British officers and men would be killed or wounded. As far as the eye could see, there were shattered villages, shell-torn fields and splintered trees. Today, the land has recovered, but everywhere there are monuments and cemeteries in memory of the men who died here. Never before or since have so many British soldiers died in such a short time. The Sheffield Pals were virtually destroyed in the horror of the Somme. At their memorial, Ellie told me what went wrong for the Pals.
First of all, the waves took time to get into position, and so they weren't very close up, so by the time they got to the German positions, there weren't many of them. But secondly, when they did get there, the barbed wire, which wasn't cut by the artillery, meant that even if they did get there, they couldn't get through. And those that did find a gap in the barbed wire had German machine guns trained onto them. So it's a completely tragic situation. Very, very few got through to the German lines.
I mean, so it must be absolutely awful. They were there up against the wire and just being mown down by machine gun fire.
Yes, with nowhere to go.
By the end of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 588 of the Sheffield Pals, nearly 2/3 of the battalion, were left dead or wounded. All their training on the moors couldn't have prepared them for what happened here.
This is where many of the Sheffield Pals actually ended up being buried, the ones who died in the Battle of the Somme. In fact, one of the soldiers wrote that the battalion was 2 years in the making and 10 minutes in the destroying.
And it wasn't just the battalion that was largely destroyed. The whole PALS system really came to an end at this time because communities back home had lost at one stroke most of their young men.
Yeah. You know what's incredible now is it's not just cemeteries like this that provide testimony to their sacrifice, because we now know that on that little hill above Sheffield there's yet another memorial to the bravery of the Sheffield City Battalion.
Venture a little further afield later tonight. Go around the world in 80 days from the comfort of your sitting room at 11 tonight. Up next, we reveal the real fallout from the world's worst nuclear disaster.